by Eritrean and Ethiopian aligned forces. And of course, there was already a locust invasion in Tigray prior, and all of these things compounded have made life very difficult for survivors. So today, Dr. Sarah will discuss the situation of those survivors on the ground. Dr. Sarah, please join the stage. Okay, sorry everyone. We're having some technical difficulties with people who are trying to join. It looks like Dr. Sarah is trying to come in, but keeps being disconnected. They're both joining us from Mekelle directly. And so as you know, there's an issue there, and we're not able to get in. We'd like to just take a brief minute to show a quick video before we bring in our next speaker. We just want to see if we can try and connect with Dr. Sarah or with Dr. Hadgu. If you just give us one moment. Okay, I am adapting here on the fly. We are going to just keep moving forward and see if we can get our sisters from Mekelle back connected. And in the meantime, I know who is ready because he is not facing the same technical difficulties. He is someone I'm a huge fan of. He needs very little introduction. But a big question is, are Tigrayans facing genocide? In 16 months, Tigrayans have been villainized, called traitors, thieves, devils, daytime hyenas, harassed, placed in concentration camps. Women have been the target of the cruelest forms of rape. And as we mentioned earlier, just yesterday, there was a 5-minute video of Tigrayans being burned alive by uniformed representatives and supporters of the Ethiopian government. No one is more qualified to answer the question about whether what is happening in Tigray is genocide than Professor Mukesh Kapila. He has more than 30 years of experience in promoting peace and promoting human rights in various NGOs, including the Red Cross and the UN. Professor Kapila is literally the whistleblower on the genocide in Darfur. And today he's with us to answer the question, is what is happening in Tigray a genocide? So I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Mukesh Kapila.
Thank you, Millet. And I wish I could say I'm happy to join you, but it seems a strange thing to say that I'm happy to join you. on this terrible topic. You can hear me, I hope, and I'm not having the same. Okay, good. What I've been asked to speak about is sexual violence and its links to genocide in the context of this particular event. Well, first thing to say is that sexual violence is very common in the world. A study from the World Health Organization some time ago showed that maybe 1 in 3 women in the world have experience of sexual violence at some time during their lives. And in some countries, in some continents, and Africa is notorious. Sorry, I don't know how I muted myself. So I was just saying that sexual violence is very common. According to a WHO study, maybe 1 in 3 women in the world have experienced it, and in some continents, and unfortunately, Africa is in the vanguard on this, maybe 1 in 2. So it's common. The other thing we know about sexual violence, it comes in many forms. There is, of course, rape, but there are many forms of rape. We also know that it's the psychological effects of rape are as serious as any other effects there are. And we also know that in the context of wars, very often sexual violence is accompanied by violence. So sexual violence in the context of conflict is not sexual, it is just violence. And certainly in my own experience of working with women affected by violence in war, it is quite clear that the multidimensional effect of sexual violence leaves a long and pervasive influence on the individual. Now, in this context, what we're talking, I'm not going to give you statistics about Tigray because there'll be others who already will speak about it. Tens of thousands of women have been affected. We don't know how many, but we certainly know that whatever estimates you have in Tigray, they're going to be an underestimate because by and large, these conditions are underreported, if you like. Women don't like admitting when they've been at the receiving end of violence. So in the context of thinking about genocide, what can we say? Firstly, obviously, sexual violence is a crime. So the first level of the crime is it's a crime under the domestic jurisdiction of any country. I don't think any country in the world doesn't have a law against it. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that historically speaking, in the context of wars, it wasn't looked upon very seriously. It was seen as some kind of moral crime, an outrage to modesty, an outrage to, I mean, this very kind of, this term modesty. So whereas other forms of war crimes were looked on as much more seriously, sexual violence in the context of conflict was seen as a secondary crime, a less serious happening, traditionally speaking. And this possibly explains why it doesn't get as much attention as now, because that attitude still remains on part of in the world, basically. We also have to distinguish between crimes against humanity and genocide. Genocide is a form of crimes against humanity, obviously. Now, in a crime against humanity, terrible things happen, as we know, but that is not the same thing as a genocide, because you have to have an intention to actually eliminate someone as part of that. Sorry, my screen keeps on doing funny things. I hope you're all listening me. Someone is trying to show me their screen. Can they please go away and not share their screen? Yes. Because it distracts me. So what I'm saying here is, if we are talking about redress in the context of sexual violence in Tigray, we have to be clear as to what is it. Is it a war crime? Is it a crime against humanity, or is it a genocide? Of course, it is all three. But the legal remedy has to be more precisely done if there is going to be justice. It is probable, with all the evidence that is accumulated, that it has been part of a war crime strategy, right? And at the same time, because it has been done on a mass scale, and what I observed for myself in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, where I was involved, is the act of committing rapes on hundreds of women and thousands of women in rapid time can only be done if it is under organized command and control. If you were doing it randomly, meaning just bad men doing bad things to women, which happens everywhere in the world, it's not possible to commit so many, to rape so many women so fast. And very definitely, the stories of gang rape we are getting and the stories of violence that we are getting in association with the sexual violence in Tigray points towards an organized, orchestrated effort, right? So the command and control aspects of that are really quite important. Now, so whenever these crimes are prosecuted, it's very, very important to get all the evidence of that, not just the evidence of terrible things having been done to thousands of women. On that, I think there's a lot of evidence already, video and others. But to go and tease out the chain of events that led this to happen and the extent to which it happened, and through the act demonstrating that it was an intentional act as opposed to the chaos and fog of war, is an important part of the evidence chain that has to be constructed. Now, fortunately, the law is improving and evolving. So what happened in the case of the tribunals on Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda was that the judges and lawyers, they extended the law in relation to atrocity crimes, in relation to crimes against humanity and genocide itself, so as to impute intent from the pattern of actions. I mean, in the end, only Abe knows what's in his own mind, right? So, unlike the case of Hitler, where the Germans were logging and there were plenty of communications available that we could study afterward and say, right, these orders were given by these leaders of the Nazis to do this, that, and the other. Now, nobody, unless they're extraordinarily stupid, writes down orders nowadays, you see. And today, orders are all ephemeral. They'll be on email, they'll be on SMS messages. So unless they're preserved, very, very difficult to prove intent. But the law has been evolving ever since Rwanda times to indicate that in any reasonable appreciation of a situation, the nature and acts and the patterns of what's happening, the most likely probability of that happening is through an orchestrated action, which could only be done by someone in command and control. So that's a good thing in terms of the law that has gradually been extended out of the miseries of Rwanda and former Yugoslavia. And fortunately, this is what the International Criminal Court recognized, because the International Criminal Court's law, the ICC, came after the experiences of Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, to recognize that sexual violence, with the patterns that you get, is a qualifying act for a genocide as defined by the statutes of the International Criminal Court, not just the statutes of the Genocide Convention, which we've had for 60 odd years, but by the more modern law of the International Criminal Court. And that's very important to appreciate. So in my mind, I'm kind of not sitting there forensically investigating or what, but certainly from what I have seen and heard and analyzed and cases I've heard, I would say there is an extremely high ground that what's going on in Tigray in relation to sexual violence is a war crime, is a crime against humanity, and a genocide. And it's possible to have all those things. It's possible for a crime to be all of that for the same crime, in a way. That's quite important to understand. The reason it's also important to understand why it's a genocide, because what happens is not just the question of intent. Now, what genocide law says is that you're trying to alter the composition of a group of people, either by eliminating that group of people or changing their characteristics. So when you rape women and traumatize them on a systematic and mass scale, you're doing a couple of things. Firstly, you are impregnating the women, often the case. And what that means is you are changing the ethnic composition of the population if you do it on enough scale. So in Darfur, for example, where I was a direct witness to this, raped women who came to my office in Khartoum would tell me, one woman, for example, came and told me that she'd been raped in front of her husband and children and so on, and that, something like 10 or 20 soldiers raped her, and they were shouting that we will give you Arab babies. This was a woman from the Darfuri black groups, and the conflict that time was between the Arab identified and the black identified groups. So the intent there was to change the composition of the group, ethnic cleansing, we call it, in a way, literally in this sense, ethnic cleansing. Of course, no genocide in the world ever has worked, if you like to see. So you don't have to prove that it was successful. You don't have to impregnate all the women of Tigray to say that the composition has been changed. You have to do enough, and you have to imply and intend enough to be able to satisfy that particular criteria of altering the composition of the group. The second way you through rape you alter the composition of a group is that you change. So even if a woman doesn't get pregnant, she is so completely traumatized, so completely spaced out. I mean, I as a man, I can only very feebly understand what a woman must go through, and men can only be ashamed of this. So her womb, according to psychologists, then her womb is no longer available. So even if she didn't become pregnant, and even if she wasn't gang raped, but she went through this experience and she emerged from the other end, she's a changed woman. She's not necessarily, inverted commas, emotionally available to resume normal membership of the community of which she's a part, right? She is forever. So her womb is literally emotionally not available. Remember, the word womb comes from, traditionally, it came from basically the emotions, in a way. Our ancient physicians, obviously they were very misogynistic. They thought that a woman's kind of life and soul rested in a womb. We know this is this is never true, but the cultural idea, the emotional idea, still has a very powerful hold on society. So a rapist does two things. One, rapes a woman, impregnates her, or gives her a disease, or subjects her to physical violence. So as we heard from testimonies, they had to be operated upon, or as I saw in many cases, because female genital mutilation is also very common in parts of North Africa, we've got huge traumas, and the woman becomes sexually infertile, apart from not emotionally wanting sexual relations subsequently. So the womb is unavailable apart from being damaged. Another way that this becomes a genocide is that the symbolic effect it has on society. So, for example, when your women have been penetrated, violated, humiliated, so are you as a man violated, and so are you as a man also penetrated. in the sense that your complete sense of your ego, and I don't want here to get into egoistic relations in men and women. I'm just trying to make the point that it has such a huge effect in terms of the relationship between men and women subsequent to the event. And and it will require men of extraordinary understanding. And there are such men, and we must salute them, and I'll come to why I'm talking about this in a minute. So it doesn't matter. It's not about 100,000 women being raped. The effect of that is much greater beyond that, and it is there for a very long period of time. I think you get my point. The other point I want to make in this is that, and I've seen this at first hand, for example, with the Rwandan survivors of rape, and my God, that was on an industrial scale. That I saw this in Goma, in eastern Zaire at that time. All the Rwandan refugees, women who came out lying there mute for weeks at a time in the hospital I was at. They're injured, they're traumatized, that is obvious. But as the women told me, they are then secondary victims of their own society. So as I saw for myself, especially, and by the way, not just Rwandans, but in the DRC, I think some people have said that Congo is actually the rape capital of the world, as certainly it has been in the past. What happens is these women may get over, they might get sewn up, they might even recover, they might even, et cetera, and certainly I want to pay tribute to the number of women I've seen who have gone through awfulness of extreme order, but who seem somehow to have been able to grow out of it in some way. But the men in their lives, their families, actually victimize them second time around. You've been raped. Fine. I wish you had died. It would have been better for you to have died. Are you sure you didn't encourage them? Anyway, you are spoiled, you are soiled, etc., etc. And those are attitudes of men and their attitudes of our society. So the woman survivor becomes a double victim. So you're adding then insult to the injury. Let me conclude by talking first about health, and secondly about what do we do in terms of going forward. And obviously we've talked a little bit about the law. It's much more complicated than that. And sometimes when I talk with lawyers, I can hardly control my patience, because while people are kind of picking nits between, is this a genocide or is this a crime against humanity or is this just old-fashioned rape? I say, well, I mean, imagine if you were the receiving end of a rape, and imagine the lawyers arguing and saying, well, yours is only just ordinary rape. It's not a genocidal rape. Imagine. And so it's extremely important we don't get narrowed down into that discussion either. However, I'm just sharing with you some of the debates and the challenges that are there in the law, which is fortunately improving. Now, coming to the issue of healthcare, I think services for women and girls, and by the way, even some men who have been traumatized in this way, it requires special provision. You can't, sexual and reproductive health services, they have to be done not through integration in the mainstream of healthcare, because that's tantamount to invisibility. It needs specialized, focused, dedicated services and dedicated follow-up. So as services are set up, or not much at the moment because access is an issue, we have to remember, certainly in my experience, sexual and reproductive healthcare and mental healthcare, in response to these situations, they require highly specialized and highly targeted and personalized services. They can't just be provided by the run-of-the-mill health clinics and bit of family planning here, bit of HIV treatment there, etc., etc. That's, I think, the only point I'm going to make. Second point I'm going to make is that in terms of is relief of trauma, its implication, what I've already said about the women being second. Please, let us see if we can educate Tigrayan society. And let us see if we can educate Tigrayan men to not disrespect the women who have been sexually violated, right? And somehow find it within them to rise above all this. And that will only happen if we discuss it openly, if men take a leadership position in this. Women talking about women's problems to other women isn't going to get us anywhere at all, to say it bluntly. And I am, quite frankly, completely disappointed by the women in the international system, whether it is the Deputy Secretary General or whether it's a special representative for sexual violence, and all these are good women and so on. But in my experience, women leaders have shown the least leadership and have betrayed their sisters more than anyone else. And I often wonder late into the night when I can't sleep, why is it that they're betrayed? Why do I get so emotional about this? And I feel ashamed about this because my kind are going around doing these kinds of things. And I can't understand why women are not, they're activists and feminists who do those kinds of things as part of human rights organizations and so on. But I do not see the outrage that the women leaders are bringing in this area. And that applies not just to UN women leaders, but there are African women leaders in parliamentarians, there are in many institutions and so on and so forth. And this, quite frankly, is disgusting in a way. And they need to be called out. They are betrayers of their fellow women. Now, coming in conclusion then, I would say there is a program here, other than in advocacy and calling the women out. We have to do something about saying to men, please, what's happened is happened, what's happening is happening. What has happened to tens of thousands of women? By the way, now sexual trafficking is going on in Ukraine. Things, millions have left Ukraine and they're sitting in Poland and Romania and various places. I hope to be going there shortly. I wish I could come to Tigray, by the way. If somebody could let me into Tigray, I would move from where I am now in Dubai straight. I would catch a plane, if you like. But pending that, I'm hoping to go to Ukraine at least. Now, we have to find a way of ensuring that the social stigmas and taboos are removed so that these women come out and flower again. And because they are the engines of their own recovery. And what I've seen with my own eyes in the worst situations is how extraordinary resilient. I mean, I've spoken to women and said, my God, all this happened to you. How can you even smile? Surely you must be totally ruined. Don't you want to disappear under the table and never emerge? But no, they're actually rising up and they want to get on with their lives and live their lives and so on. So let us find these women survivors who are heroes and try and make men heroes who can counterpart with these women heroes. For example, the husbands of these men. For example, the fathers of these men, the sons of these men. And to say, yes, these things happen, but we are not going to be victims. We are future champions. Let me stop here.
Professor Mukesh Kapila, it is always an honor and a privilege to listen to you speak. Your authority on the subject of genocide is unmatched in the world. So we thank you for giving us your input today. I want to, just a few things you said that really stuck with me. When you talked about altering the composition of a group of people or attempting to, I just want to remind people of the things that were said to Tigrayan women. Things were said like, we are here to Amharanize your blood. Things were said like, there was a woman who asked her would-be rapist, why are you doing this? You're my brother. And he said, well, you're not the problem, but your womb is our problem. These are the kinds of things that were said to Tigrayan women. I'll never forget too, once Professor Mukesh, when you said attacking women is attacking the essence of a people. And that is certainly what has happened. I won't keep going because Dr. Sarah has joined us from Mekelle, and I know her connection is really shoddy. So I want to bring her back in. And just as a reminder, she is going to talk about the survivals who are left with mental trauma, and talk a little bit about their situation and their challenges and the way forward. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah. Oh, okay, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Lemlem is also here.